Good afternoon, everybody. My name's James Cadman. I'm Head of Consultancy and Carbon at Action Sustainability and the Supply Chain School. I'm just going to give it a few seconds for people to join the webinar. You can see the numbers ticking up slowly. When we get to a bigger number, we'll carry on. So just make yourselves comfortable for the next few seconds. Cool. Okay, let's make a start. So yeah, as I said, my name's James Cadman. I'm Head of Consultancy and Carbon at Action Sustainability. We're the organisation behind the Supply Chain Sustainability School, which is how you got into this session. We're going to be talking about climate change and carbon today. Obviously, COP26 has started, and we've got lots of high expectations for what's going to come out of that over the next couple of weeks. So let me just share my screen with you. And I'll rearrange my desktop a little bit. There we go. And then we shall get on in a second with what we've got today. Super. So hopefully you can all see my screen. We're going to talk about climate change and carbon footprinting today to give you a real beginner's introduction into how and why we should be taking action against climate change. The overview of today's session, we're going to talk about climate change in particular, the science behind climate change, and then importantly what we can do about it, what our carbon reduction strategies and opportunities are. I'll give you a quick run through what carbon footprinting is, which is at the core of all this. How do we measure what we're going to go and manage? I'll give you a case study or two along the way, and then also some guidance on useful resources that you can take away and use later. Importantly from that, we will be sharing the slides after the session, so if you want to take notes or screenshots, by all means do so, but you will be getting a PDF copy of the slides so you can refer back to them later. And a couple of the slides are quite dense with text, and that's meant for being a reference document later. So don't worry about not being able to see those because you'll get the slides. We are recording the session, so if you'd like to listen back later or you'd like to share it with colleagues, then by all means, please do so. There is a Q&A function within Zoom. I'm sure many of you have used Zoom before now, so if you want to pose a question, I'll try and get around to some of those at the end, but there's a Q&A box that you can put in a question, and I'll get through to those. And then finally, there'll be a feedback link provided by Rosie for you to give your feedback on the session today, but also other sessions that you might want through the Supply Chain School. Okay. One thing that we're going to do as well, and if any of you have been on a school workshop or a webinar before, you'll have heard of Mentimeter. I'm going to give you a couple of questions for a bit of fun halfway through the session using a bit of software called Mentimeter. For those of you who haven't used it, it's really simple to get access to. You simply go to www.menti.com and you can do that on your phone, on your laptop. You can download an app in particular if you want to. Really easy to access, and at the right time I'll give you an 8-digit PIN code to join the quiz basically. It's a bit like Kahoot or Slido if you've used those before. We do recommend that you use Chrome or Firefox if you're using your laptop. For some reason it doesn't really work so well with Microsoft Edge or Internet Explorer, so if you can use Chrome or Firefox then great. Otherwise, if you've got a smartphone to hand, that's normally the simplest way of doing it, but we'll come on to that a bit later once we've gone through some of the basics. But if you want to kind of get that ready, then you're in the right place. Okay, cool. So climate change, going back to first principles here, basic principles, and the greenhouse gas effect. This is quite a natural phenomenon. Without it, we wouldn't be able to survive. The Earth would be far too cold if we didn't have the greenhouse gas effect. It keeps the Earth's temperature to about 15 degrees Celsius on average globally, because of the atmosphere around us, keeping some of the Earth's the warmth in that the Earth generates from sunlight. So sunlight comes through the atmosphere, bounces off the ground, and it gets trapped a bit like a duvet by the atmosphere, and that's what keeps us warm and allows us to have liquid water and allows us to grow crops and so on. As I say, without it, we'd have a very icy cold planet indeed. So the greenhouse gas effect is normal, but what we're doing is exacerbating it. We're putting more gases into the atmosphere, which are making that duvet a bit thicker. We're increasing the TOG rating, if you will, on your bed, and we're trapping more of the sun's radiation within the atmosphere. Less of it is leaking out into space, less of it is escaping. So the Earth's atmosphere is getting warmer, and that's the greenhouse gas effect. It's like putting a greenhouse gas over the planet. So it's quite a natural phenomenon. It's meant to happen, but what we're doing is making it more so. We're exacerbating it. And to put some numbers on that, and there's quite a few graphs, so if you love a graph, you're in the right place. I love graph, as you might find out in the next few minutes. What this one is telling us is how much we as a planet are emitting in terms of carbon dioxide, one of the main gases for global warming, over the last 150 years or so. And as you can see, the curve goes up very steeply as we get closer to modern day. And you can see some of the countries that are the chief emitters of those greenhouse gas emissions. But essentially, we're emitting something like 35, 40 billion tons of CO2 every year into the atmosphere. When you add in some of the other greenhouse gases, it's more like 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases emitted every year. Let's put this into some context. Over the whole lifetime of us being on the planet, and particularly the Industrial Revolution, we've emitted as a species something like 2,400 billion tons of greenhouse gases. And we're currently emitting them at a rate of about, as I said, 35, 40 billion tons a year. This is important because we've got an upper limit of how much we can emit if we're going to reduce the negative impacts of the changes in the climate that we're seeing. So you can see there's been this sharp rise in CO2 emissions, and these are measured emissions. And this is all building the case for the human-induced changes to the climate. So increases in direct CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases as well, like methane and so on. And what this has led to is an increase in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So if you go back to that first slide I showed you with the Earth's atmosphere, that duvet or that greenhouse around the planet, what we're doing is pumping in more and more greenhouse gases into that. And what this blue line graph shows you is the concentration of carbon dioxide over almost 1 million years. You can see on the bottom axis that it's almost 1 million years back in time. And what it's telling us is that the concentration, those numbers up the left-hand side, has been fairly steadily up and down over 1 million years or so, 800,000 years. And when it was higher, we had warm periods, and when it was lower, we had ice ages, but it's gone up and down fairly steadily. But in the last 150, 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, it's gone up a lot. And you can see it's now well over 400 ppm. So ppm means parts per million. Essentially, for every million molecules that are floating around your head, 400 of them are carbon dioxide. So a small amount, but a significant amount in terms of the impact it has in trapping the sun's rays in and keeping us warm. So clearly, it's out of ordinary. It's extraordinary what's happened in the last 200 odd years. And just to put some context on that, when we appeared on the planet, it's quite a long time ago. So the evidence is there that we are pumping more CO2 into the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. The concentration is going up, and this has been measured by extracts from ice cores from Antarctica that can be measured for CO2 concentration. And what that has done is led to a rise in global temperatures. So you remember a few minutes ago, I said that the average temperature was about 15 Celsius globally. Obviously, it's colder the further north or south you go, and it's warm around the equator, but on average, it's about 15. But over the last 150, 200 years, it's gone up by about 1 degree Celsius, something nearer 1.1 degrees Celsius now. So on average, the temperature has risen. So you can see this link of effects. More CO2 is emitted, the concentration in the atmosphere goes up, there's more of it retained, less of it being absorbed, and the temperature goes up. So all these things are linked and have been measured as well by various observatories and scientists out in the field. What does this mean overall? Well, we see it in the news pretty much daily these days, if not weekly. There's recent reports because of COP26 in Glasgow about flooding in southwest Scotland with the recent rains. Various rivers have burst their banks. But you can see the broad array of different events have happened, whether it's wildfires in Australia, flooding in Central Europe in the summer, extreme drought in Southern Africa, shrinking ice caps, and so on. These are all, let's be honest, quite natural weather phenomena. But what climate change does is it exacerbates them. It makes them more frequent and more extreme. They're happening more often and happening more extremely, particularly things like hurricanes in the Caribbean as one good example. So the difference here is not about the weather we see out of our window every day. It's about that long-term trend in the climate, that these things happen more often and more extremely, with the obvious impacts on lives, on economies, on the fabric of buildings, and so on. So there's a lot of evidence out there to say this is definitely happening, and we need to do something about it. Putting some context on who are the biggest emitters and where they come from. This graph quite neatly displays which countries are the biggest emitters, and unsurprisingly, you've got China, the US, Russia in there, India as well, and obviously the darker the red, the more that they emit per year as a country. Just putting some stats on that. China emits over a quarter of the emissions for the whole planet, and the US about 15% as well. So it's really important that we have these countries involved as well. But that's not to say that other countries can't get involved as well. Everyone has their part to play. So even, Ireland at 0.1% of the overall total has its part to play. We all have a contribution to make. And just turning that data on its head for a moment, if you put it in terms of per capita, so for each one of us on the planet, per person, those emissions flip around. China isn't as big an emitter as you'd expect, because per person, even though they've got lots of people, but per person, it's a far, far lower number than you'd expect from them being the biggest emitters. They still emit a lot per person, but not as much as the US or Russia, as you can see from those stats. And then again, the UK is in there, and you can see where our relative emissions come from. I thought I'd just point out some countries which are really high, like Qatar in the Middle East is a ridiculously high number. But you can see it's not a straightforward decision about that country emits the most, it needs to do less. It's that plus other things as well. It's a complicated situation. In terms of where those greenhouse gases come from, which sectors emit the most, this is one of many graphs that you can find floating around on the internet, but it just highlights some of the key sectors where greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions come from. And if you crane your head round as much as you can see that various sectors of the economy contribute in different ways. Obviously, energy is a big consumption, and that is the direct consumption and combustion of fuels in many cases. But it's split out by different sectors, whether it's industry, whether it's buildings, whether it's transport. So each sector's got its own consumption, but also therefore its own route to decarbonising, to reducing those emissions as much as possible. So much of that, about 3/4, is direct energy consumption, different fuels that we're consuming. But there's a quarter as well, which is not fuels directly. It's from chemical processes, biological processes, and agriculture. So there are more facets to this than just combustion, just burning fossil fuels, essentially. So what this graph is telling us really is that everyone has their part to play. Every sector has its part to play. Okay, so what are the key causes of climate change? Normally, if I was in a workshop setting, I'd get people to shout out and put their hands up, but this time I'm going to give you the answers. Carbon dioxide, as I've been saying, is the most prevalent. That's essentially combustion. You burn something, you get CO2 coming off the back of it, whether it's fuel for power, or vehicles or transport. Some of those are the key issues, but also some chemical processes as well. The production of cement, for example, produces CO2 as a byproduct of making the cement. Methane is a big greenhouse gas as well, an important one, largely related to agriculture, but also biodegradation, decomposition of waste materials as well, that can give off methane. Nitrous oxide, some of you might know of it as laughing gas or Entonox, has many uses, of which I've just named two, but also as a propellant gas. It's a very safe gas in terms of using it to force liquids and gases out of canisters, but has really quite high impacts on the climate. And then we get some more technical compounds, such as sulfur hexafluoride, that's often used in switchgear, high voltage switchgear, because it is a fire retardant. It stops flammability in high voltage systems, so really useful if you're in power supply. And then there's some other compounds down there, and the two that I want to highlight there are hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons, which are often used in air conditioning systems, HVAC and so on, because they've got good properties for heating and cooling. Ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps, they'll all use those kinds of compounds as well. The main 6 of those are grouped into what's known as the Kyoto Protocol basket of 6 greenhouse gases. They're the most prevalent. There are others as well. There's one named there, nitrogen trifluoride, which is used in some special semiconductor and high-tech electronics applications, but it's a bit less prevalent. It's a bit more niche than some of the others. The other 6 are the main 6, and they get the focus. in terms of our actions going forward. That's not to say that there aren't other gases that cause global warming as well, but focus on these. And these are the ones that we're looking at to maintain as much as possible our limit on the increase in the global temperature in line with the Kyoto Protocol and more recently the Paris Climate Change Agreement, to limit it to no more than 1.5 degrees above those pre-industrial levels that I was talking about in the earlier slides. So what's been done about it? That's the kind of the science. What is climate change? And in very brief terms, what are governments doing about it? So a little bit of the backstory. You can go back to 1987 and to the Brundtland Report, which gave that definition of sustainable development about looking after, using what we need today, but making sure there's still enough for our children and our grandchildren and so on. And then you take that through the Rio Earth Summit in '92, which was broader than just climate change, but it was a lot about what was happening at that point. And that led to something called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That came directly out of the Rio Earth Summit in '92. And it's the UNFCCC that essentially sets up the Conference of Parties that's happening now in Glasgow. They run it, they organise it. They had a big meeting in Kyoto in 1997, and that led to the Kyoto Protocol, the first landmark declaration that countries across the globe need to come together, joint action and work on climate change. And the Kyoto Protocol itself, once drafted and agreed and ratified, lasted from 2005 to 2020, when it was superseded by the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So Paris happened in 2015, it was ratified in 2016, and then it took on from the Kyoto Protocol in 2020, and it's going to run for 15 years in terms of what we're doing. And obviously, as of today, as of last night, COP26, the Conference of Parties, the 26th Conference of Parties, is happening in Glasgow, and following on from the various other COPs that have happened in between and trying to really drive action forward. So all eyes are on Glasgow this week and next week. Out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement came the concept of reducing our emissions as much as possible. And what this graph is trying to show us is what the temperature and climate scenarios could be, depending on how much greenhouse gas we emit. So what we've got here, let me just break it down for you. Along the bottom axis, we've got the timeline from 1990 into the future to 2100. At the left-hand side, we've got emissions of greenhouse gas emissions in gigatons, which is billions of tons, and you see it goes 50, 100, 150. And then the line is basically how much we're going to be emitting under various different scenarios. So you can see from the left-hand side, there's a kind of a very dark grey black line that's kind of ticking its way up. That's the same as one of the first slides I showed you, how much we're emitting as a planet cumulatively in terms of greenhouse gas emissions going up. So it's at about 50 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Just to be clear, that's slightly different than just carbon dioxide on its own, which is about 35, 40. We're talking about all greenhouse gases, the methane, the nitrous oxide, all the other bits and bobs I talked about. So we're about 50. And then looking to the right, where you've got those lovely pastel shades of pink and orange and purple and so on, those are the different scenarios depending on how much we emit in the future. If we carry on emitting, if I put these up, if we carry on and do nothing basically, and our emissions just follow the same trajectory upwards, we follow the same slope as we are on now, the Earth could warm somewhere between 4 and 5 degrees Celsius with huge devastating impacts on the climate, on day-to-day weather, on biodiversity, on life as we know it. Clearly, we don't want to be there. If we start bending that curve, to use some language from COVID last year, if we're trying to bend that curve down so we're emitting gradually less and less greenhouse gas emissions, we have some different scenarios that come in. And that's what these other ones are. Current policies will keep us at about the high 2s, 3 degrees Celsius, still huge impacts, huge changes, as various reports over the summer demonstrated. But we're bending that curve slowly. If we make some pledges and targets, we'll keep it down to about 2.5 degrees, 2.4, and bringing that curve slowly down. But realistically, it's not good enough considering the impact that it will bring. And then there's these bottom two scenarios, which came out of Paris directly, and more recently the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. What can we do, or what do we need to do if we're going to maintain a 2-degree pathway? So in other words, the average global temperature will only go up by 2 degrees Celsius on average across the whole globe. And what would the impacts look like that? And how much do we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to get there? That's what that kind of slightly mauve violet shade looks like. But if we want to do even more, we should go for the 1.5 degree pathway, which was essentially what the report in August was saying. We need to strive for 1.5 degree pathway. We go all out and reduce those emissions. So that's essentially what we're aiming to do. Bearing in mind, we're already at 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And just to put a line on where 2050 is, this brings in the concept of net zero. So if you look at that red line at 2050, and if you see where it intersects with the kind of green line for the 1.5 degree pathway, you'll see there's still a bit of a gap. We are still emitting some greenhouse gas emissions. And that's where net zero comes in, because overall we're still emitting some greenhouse gases, and that could be from agriculture, where it's a natural process, it's a biological process. Other systems as well, other chemical processes where we can't get away from it, we still have emissions. We need to do something with them. We need to remove them. We need to abate them in somehow, compensate for them. So that's why we have the concept of net zero. It's not absolute zero, it's net. And that's why we have that little gap still. So what are we doing in the UK? Well, there's been the Climate Change Act for several years now, since 2008. It was updated in 2019. And that's about what the UK is going to do with its own territorial emissions to bring our emissions down as well. And you can see on this graph, again, apologies, I do like graphs, as I said. You've got the timeline along the bottom, and along the y-axis, you've got the emissions for the UK. And these are in millions of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, in megatons. And you can see with that solid black line on the kind of the first half of the graph on the left, that we've brought our emissions down from about 900 megatons to about 500 megatons since 1990. So it's about a 40% reduction, and that's really good going. A lot of that has been what some people might call low-hanging fruit. We've decarbonised our electricity grid really well. We've moved away predominantly from coal, more to gas, more renewable. So we've reduced the carbon intensity of our electricity grid, and we've done other things as well. Buildings are slowly becoming more efficient. Vehicles are slowly becoming more efficient. But there's still a long way to go. And that's what that purple dashed line is. That's the route we need to take as a country down to our version of net zero. And underneath that, you'll see these little columns that say CB4, CB5. Those are carbon budgets for the UK. And they're plans that the Committee for Climate Change have developed to say that these sectors, big sectors like housing, manufacturing, transport, and so on, agriculture, need to do to bring emissions down. So obviously there's a range of different things to develop. So that's where our concept of net zero comes in, and it's part of UK law that we'll be net zero by 2050. Scotland and Wales have got slightly different versions because of the ability in those countries to do something slightly different, and that's good, and it can be based on the economy that they have there. Likewise, Ireland, the Republic, has got its own legislation for 2050. And more recently, the UK put in an intermediate target as legislation that we'd be reducing our emissions by 78% by 2035 against that 1990 baseline. So it's still on that purple dash line trajectory, but it is an intermediate milestone to make sure that we're actually tracking what we're doing along the way, and we don't wait to the end and hope it all comes out okay. So we are one of the first countries, one of the first developed countries to have legally binding targets at a national level. More countries have come on board, and I'm sure you've seen people like Liz Truss talking about, there's now 80% of the delegates have, at COP26, have got something like this, whereas at the beginning of our presidency for COP, there was about 30% of the world's countries that had some kind of target. So the momentum is picking up, definitely. Bringing it close to home, some of you will be aware that the UK government introduced one of its procurement policy notes back in the summer, back in June, PPN 0621, which is essentially a procurement policy note that requires all government spend over £5 million per year to have a carbon reduction plan that's in line with our net zero target nationally. And that means that all contractors working on that work and on that project need to likewise have a carbon reduction strategy that aligns with net zero. And if I know anything about contracts and procurement, it means that that will be cascaded down through the supply chain. So this is starting to take effect. There'll be more coming out of government, no doubt, in terms of other follow-up PPNs. This aligns very much with the other PPN that came out a year prior to that, PPN 0620, the one on social value that you might be aware of. Within the social value one, it has a section specifically on fighting climate change. So they are linked, they are aligned, but it's very much coming through supply chain as well as through kind of more regulatory instruments, such as the streamlined energy carbon reporting requirements for larger businesses to actually actively report their carbon emissions on an annual basis. So there are many ways to getting this. Okay. Bringing it closer to home to the construction sector, the built environment. The Construction Leadership Council came out a few months ago, 6 months ago now, with their plan for what the construction sector should be doing and will be doing in and around reducing carbon emissions, and giving you the high level here that they were touching on all points around transport, using zero emission vehicles, looking at buildings and retrofitting different kinds of materials, different kinds of construction methods, measuring and managing carbon impacts as well. And putting the UK at the front as well of being able to design out carbon from the beginning. If we're going to manage this, we need to be doing affecting changes from the start, rather than kind of retrofitting stuff at the end when it's too late, when we're doing new build, of course. And focusing on new materials, innovative materials, different ways of working and so on. So one of the key targets that came out of this was that we should look to reduce diesel consuming plant and equipment on construction sites by 78% by 2035, directly aligned to that milestone target I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So the CLC is on top of this. They're developing more work as we go, and the work of the Supply Chain School is to help promote that and work alongside them in delivering that. I mentioned some of the stuff that's been happening already, decarbonising the grid, and a lot of the power companies have been doing a lot of the heavy lifting for us in the meantime. And this graph shows the carbon intensity of the UK's electricity grid going back to 1990. Excuse me, and what it's telling us that in 1990, there was about 900 grams of carbon dioxide emitted for every unit of power made. For every kilowatt hour of power that was generated, there was almost a kilo of CO2 being put out of a stack somewhere. But over time, that's come down by about 2/3, and that contributes to that 40% reduction I talked about earlier with the graph for the UK. And there's two main reasons for that. As I was indicating, there's been a dash for gas. We've moved away from coal largely in the UK. And then more recently, we've had a big investment in renewables. There's lots of news items now about new offshore wind arrays going up in the North Sea in particular, but other places as well. And to a lesser extent, solar panels, biomass, CHP, onshore wind as well. So lots of investment in renewable to kind of bridge some of that gap, alongside investment in nuclear power as well, which can be a hot potato, and that's a topic for another time. But yes, a lot of work has been done to decarbonise the grid, with the view that we keep decarbonising it so it's pretty much zero carbon by the mid-2030s. In terms of net zero, what that actually means, I talked earlier about that kind of that red line with those pastel colours, and it's that bit left over. The UK's Green Building Council has produced two definitions, or two aligned definitions on what net zero means in the construction sector. One for construction itself, so it's up to the point of completion that you have reduced your emissions as far as possible, and any that you've got left over, you compensate for, you offset, or use on-site renewable power where possible. And similarly with the operation of an asset or a building, that you reduce them as much as possible, in line with what I'm going to talk about in a second, the carbon hierarchy, and then you offset any remaining emissions where needed. Offset itself is a loaded topic. More and more organisations are moving away from offsets and into greenhouse gas removal. So it's not just about compensating, it's about actively removing or balancing out those emissions. So that's something that's going to feature in one of these lunch and learns later this week, as one of the series of 4. So if you want to learn more about that, then come along to one of those. But importantly, there's lots of reasons why we should be doing this. We've heard about the science and why we should be doing it, but there's other reasons as well. There's lots of business sustainability reasons for doing this. There's a direct compliance piece with legislation, things like streamlined energy carbon reporting. There's energy security. We've seen only too recently the risks of energy supply, particularly gas. If you've got your own secure source or part of your resources secured, then you're in a better place. Clearly there's regulation, but importantly as well, it's being able to identify where your hotspots are, where your key carbon intensity is, and then take prioritize action on that. So you've got focused efforts on what you're doing. And that can lead to not only reductions in carbon, but financial savings as well. And more widely, this gives you a better reputation and more opportunity to win work. There's more to it than just simply counting carbon. So that's kind of the overview of climate change itself and the ins and outs of what it's about and why we need to reduce what we're doing. I'm going to give you a bit of a deeper dive now into how we actually measure and do something about it. What are the things we can do to reduce our carbon emissions and gain benefit from that? So there are many, many sources of carbon emissions from any organisation, as we were kind of indicating earlier with that pie chart. We've got the energy sector, transport sector, agricultural sector. Each of those sectors have got different things going on and therefore different ways of dealing with carbon emissions. If you're looking at your own organisation, your own business, you could be emitting carbon from a variety of sources as outlined on this slide, whether it's your vehicles, your buildings, your chemical processes, your biological processes, lots of different areas where they could be coming from. But likewise, as your suppliers as well, they might be doing the direct emissions themselves, but indirectly you're responsible for them. Essentially, you're paying them for a service or a product, so you are causing those emissions to be made. You have a responsibility for them, essentially. And those can come from physical materials and goods. It can come from services, utilities like waste and water, transport as well. These all contribute to carbon emissions. But in the same sense that you look to your supplier, you've got customers that are looking to you as their supplier. So it all just trickles down in a cascade. So you have a responsibility as well to your clients and your customers in the same way that your suppliers do to you. So it's making sure that what you do can help them reduce their carbon emissions through the things that they use, whether it's a building or an asset that you sell or lease, or a service that uses vehicles that you hire out and lease to people, or a product that someone might plug in and then use. You have a responsibility to them as well. So there's lots of different places where emissions come from and therefore where that responsibility lies. Bit of jargon, those in your upstream in your supply chain might be called embodied carbon. And that essentially means all the energy and carbon emissions that come from manufacturing a product or some materials, or that go into providing a transport service, for example. If you're in the infrastructure sector, it might be called capital carbon. Essentially, not quite, but essentially the same thing. Similarly, when you use something yourself in your own business, that could be called operational carbon. The consumption directly of using that product or service. So, for example, you might buy a fridge and there's embodied carbon from the manufacturer of that fridge, but there's the operational carbon when you plug it in and turn it on. That's you using it directly. And then there's the downstream end user carbon that is for a client or someone else who's using your product. So if you were the seller of that fridge, the manufacturer and the seller of that fridge, your customer would be the end user carbon in that respect. So different ways of seeing that and describing that upstream and downstream as well. So there are many different things we can do about carbon and climate change, which is one of the benefits. There's no just one single solution, which might sound a little bit annoying that we can't just say, that's a solution, tick, let's do it, move on. It does give us the flexibility to choose different options that are suitable for us in our situation, both economically and geographically and physically, things that work for us and things that we can afford. And there's just a very short list of examples that you can see on the screen now of different ways of working out how we can reduce our carbon and fitting in with budgets and availability and knowledge and competence and everything else that goes with it. But the important thing to pick up from this is the fact that there's two key aspects to it: mitigation and adaptation. They kind of do what they say on the tin. Mitigation is reducing our emissions as much as possible. Adaptation is adapting to the climate change that's happening around us already. So it could be that, like the examples on the screen, that you mitigate your impact by moving your vehicles to an electric system. But you need to adapt as well, because there might be a higher risk of flooding in your area. So you might need to change how your buildings are configured and adapting to what you're seeing now in changing weather patterns. And some of those carbon reduction actions, to put them closer to home for us, it could be the equipment that you use, it could be your vehicles, the direct impacts that you might have from the different things that you consume and different things that you use. If you're a materials-based organization, think about where those materials come from. Have they got recycled content? Are there lower carbon alternatives out there to the material that you would normally use? Can it be recycled at the end of life? It's bringing in all that circular economy thinking as well. The two are inextricably linked, between carbon, embodied carbon, and circular economy. And thinking about reuse and repurposing, just extending the lifetime of products as much as possible. Importantly, though, it's not just about stuff and things, it's about people as well. It's the other side of the coin. Without people and how they use the materials and the products and the services, a lot of those benefits are lost, or they're not optimized as much as they could be. So it's great to have automatic sensors and switches and eco modes and so on, but if people don't know how to use them, they won't be used to their optimal endpoint, their optimal efficiency. So thinking about training and people's development and competence and choosing the right equipment that suits that situation and the people using it as well. And extending that further to other ideas as well, such as lean construction, off-site construction. All of these are predicated on being more efficient, but there's going to be a sustainability, a carbon benefit to them as well. Even if they're primarily there about getting things done right first time and done more quickly, if you do it more quickly and with less defects and less waste, you're going to be saving carbon inherently. So there's different ways of looking at this that all achieve the same kind of outcome. And all of this leads to the carbon hierarchy. If you know the waste hierarchy, avoid, reduce, reuse, recycle, that we all do at home, but we do in our businesses as well, there's a carbon and energy hierarchy as well. If you can avoid using the energy in the first place and do something that's passive, that doesn't use energy, then great, go with that. The obvious one is, not driving, but going on a bicycle. That's always not always achievable, of course. So we've got to think about other ways of doing things. So avoid if you can, but in reality, you probably will have to use energy at some point. That's fine and that's understood. So if you do have to use energy, think about using less, being smarter with what you use, using more efficient equipment, stuff that's got an energy label on it that says that it's an energy efficient product. Using less material, which is the embodied carbon piece. If you can consume less material and waste less material, not only are you saving money in the time to take the materials on and off site, but you're reducing your embodied carbon as well. So there's several wins in that story already. And then the better behaviors as well, coming back to what I was just saying. If people are using the equipment more effectively and more efficiently, they're going to be saving time, they're going to be saving operational costs, direct OPEX, but also inherently the carbon that goes with it. Probably some other sustainability benefits as well, let alone person well-being and so on. Where you can, think about switching to lower carbon and renewable sources of energy and materials. So like I was saying a minute ago, more recycled content, different materials. So moving out of one material and into another that might have a lower embodied carbon, or even the same material, but an alternative that's got a lot more or different ingredients in it, which means it's got a lower embodied carbon. Speaking with your suppliers about what they can do. And then only when you've done all of these things, you've gone down all those options of reducing, avoiding, switching, being as efficient as you can, only then think about, right, I've still got some carbon that I need to get rid of. How can I deal with that? Only then think about offsetting, or more importantly, about removals. As we go forward, that compensation removal piece, that comes right at the end of the process. So that's the hierarchy. And that kind of fits into how to do a carbon reduction strategy. Sorry, I'm just going to do something here. When you're doing a carbon reduction strategy, you need to think about several things rather than just jumping in and saying, oh, we're going to buy electric vehicles. That's great, but think of it more holistically. What can we do? What are our hotspots? Where do we need to focus on? Where do we get our biggest bang for our buck? There's lots of great cliches that you can bring in here if you're going to convince your CFO. So first of all, we need to work out the scope. What are we actually including? Is it our organization? Is it our supply chain? Is it our distributor? Which depots does it cover? Which sites does it cover? What are those boundaries, physically and organizationally, importantly? And what's the base year that we're going to set to measure this against? Have we got good solid data for a financial year or a calendar year in the past that we can measure against? Because if you haven't got a baseline, you can't measure the improvement. So again, you need to pause for thought and just think, where can we set that baseline to make sure that when we are measuring it, we're getting good, credible data to say, yeah, we've reduced it by X%, we've saved Y £1,000, other benefits that come out of it. So you need that baseline as well. Then when you've set up the conditions in effect, you've set up the rules, you then need to go out and measure, gather that data and understand what your impacts are. And importantly, identify those hotspots. Where is your biggest bang for your buck? Where are you going to focus on? Is it your fleet? Is it your production site? Is it your supply chain? Which of those is it going to be? So you need to get that data before you can kind of launch forward and invest your money. Just as an aside on that, all the recent stuff about plastic straws and plastic cups is great as a signal to the wider world that we should be reducing our consumption and not wasting materials and carbon. But in terms of their actual impact, it's a drop in the ocean. So they are certainly not a hotspot. So you need to think about those as well. Things that are big hotspots where you can get big bang for your buck, but also other things where they're very prevalent and they have a high profile. They might not have a big impact, but they might grab the attention and therefore get the conversation going. So think about both of those. Once you've got your baseline there and you know where your carbon footprint is, you've measured it and you know where your hotspots are, where your high profile things are, then you need to put an action plan in place to reduce them. What are you going to do? What are the actual actions you're going to take? Is it changing the boiler in the facilities? Is it changing your fleet? Is it moving to a different material? Is it giving training to your staff? What are those things you're actually going to do to check, to actually reduce your emissions? And then go and put them in place. Have that action plan, give people responsibilities and go and put them in place. But then importantly, come back at a suitable time later and measure it again, see what that change was, see how much you've actually reduced. And then, as I was saying a few minutes ago, only when you've gone through that process and keep going around that loop, only then think about the offsets, the removals piece, right at the end of that process. And then ultimately, at some point, you want to report this. You want to tell this to other people, whether it's your shareholders, your stakeholders, definitely your colleagues, your clients, whoever you see fit, depending on your situation where you are. But telling the wider world is definitely an important thing as well, if only for being able to win more work. Here's one brief case study example of where they thought about carbon holistically from the beginning at the design stage before they went ahead and did construction. Really important to do it like that because you get the biggest bang for your buck again. I've used that phrase quite a lot, but it's really important because if you do it afterwards, you're going to miss a lot of those opportunities. So the Cooperative Bank built a new set of offices up near Manchester, and they thought about how they could avoid energy, how they could use different forms of materials, how they could be a lot more sensitive to carbon emissions. So as you can see on the slide, they considered different routes to using passive building techniques, using passive light and passive airflow to reduce the burden on the HVAC equipment. They still need HVAC, but a lot less burden. So that's less energy, less money, less carbon. But it also leads into well-being as well, because if you've got an area, lighter space for people to work in, that kind of thing comes along with it as well. Better air quality goes with it as well. And then, as we've seen already, some of the, the more efficient equipment that you can use, water as well as energy, grey water and rainwater harvesting is part of that. Building all of that in, looking at all the different opportunities where they can do something a bit more efficiently, a bit better, or just not use it at all, led to them getting these kinds of stats in terms of less carbon, less energy being consumed, and a good BREEAM rating out the back of it. And there are dozens of these kinds of examples if you go looking on the internet, particularly across commercial developments, but also infrastructure and other sectors of the built environment. Okay, we're going to quickly jump into how do you compare. So this is where I want you to get your Mentimeter. I'm going to ask you a question in a minute, but just to remind you, you need to get your Mentimeter on your phone, www.menti.com. It'll look like the picture on the screen. If you can do it on your phone or a tab on your browser, that'd be really good. So get that ready. The question is, which is better for carbon, traveling by train or by plane for the same distance? This one isn't a trick question. So which is better for carbon, traveling by train or plane for the same distance? And the answer is basically traveling by train is the quickest one. I'll pop the Menti code up in a second. How much better is the train in percentage terms compared to the plane? So we're looking for a number, and you're going to get a 1 in 4 opportunity for percentages to choose on how much better the train is. I'll just get the right slide. So the code is 8418 8459. So let me just put that in the box as well. 8418. I can see some of you coming in. That's great. 8459. Excellent, Rosie's done that. Thank you, Rosie. So just give a second for people to come in. Love all the different icons that are coming in. You're bunching in. Cool, great. So 8-digit PIN code 8418 8459. I'm going to start the countdown. So as I say, you get a 1 in 4 chance on this. So how much better percentage-wise for carbon is traveling by train compared to plane for the same distance? Is the train 80% better, or 10% better, 60 or 40%? There we go. Excellent. Cool. So the answer was 80% better. So well done to 16 of you. It was a 1 in 4 chance, so don't worry. It was a bit of a stab in the dark, but the whole purpose of this is to give you an idea of you wouldn't be able to make that decision unless you got the data. Unless you can get the data, you've got no sense of, well, which is better and which is worse. So just to put some numbers on that, this is a real journey that I did to give one of these kinds of workshops 3 years ago, something like that, in Glasgow, coincidentally. And I compared the impact by traveling by train compared to plane. And highlighted in the red box is the difference that I calculated. About an 80% reduction going by train than by plane. And also, I looked at other things like cost and time and so on, which you should do if you're doing a good procurement exercise. It's not just about carbon, but carbon can help you with that process. So we knew that we had a hunch that train was better than plane, but we didn't have a hunch about how much better it was. Unless you do the carbon measurement and get that kind of footprint, you're not going to know to that kind of level of detail or accuracy. So that's the reason why we need to measure our carbon and get that baseline. Okay, so the second of 2 questions. Oh, let me just pop back here. The second of 2 questions, which is better for carbon, the plastic bag on the left, other supermarkets are available, or the cotton bag on the right? Assuming that they're the same volume, you can get the same amount of groceries in them. The question is, which one's better? The reality is the plastic bag is actually better, and that might be a bit of a shock. The plastic bag on a per unit basis is better than the cotton bag. But how often, the question to you guys is, how often do you need to use the cotton bag for it to have a lower footprint than the plastic bag? And the reason being, the cotton bag has a far higher footprint due to all the cotton and the consumption of pesticides, fertilizers, water, all the processes that are going in to make that cotton bag are far, far more intensive than the plastic bag. But by how much? So if we go back onto here, we'll go on to the next question. So again, you've got a 1 in 4 chance. Just getting the countdown. So how often do you need to use the cotton bag for it to have a lower footprint than the plastic bag? Do you need to use it 320 times, or just 20 times, or 130, or 50 times? So just while you're choosing, the cotton bag uses, as I say, lots of different chemicals and inputs and water and energy to manufacture it. So it has a bigger impact than the plastic bag, but by how much? Cool. Okay, so well done to 27 of you. Yes, the answer was 130 times. So you have to use that cotton bag over 130 times for it to have a lower footprint than, or the same as footprint as the plastic bag. As I say, because it's all those inputs that go into making it. So you might look at 2 things and think, well, they do the same function, they look the same, one's plastic, one's cotton, but they're essentially the same thing. How do I compare? Which one do I choose, and how does it help me? So you need to do all your analysis about cost and availability and quality of product and delivery and after sales service, all that good stuff you do with your suppliers and your products. But think about carbon as well. So carbon is another decision point within that process for you. And what this says to me is, if you're going to use your cotton bag lots and lots of times, it's probably a good investment. But if you're not using it that many times, then it's not, in terms of carbon anyway. And you can see some of the other options on there for bags for life and so on. So carbon footprinting really does help you with that. To which point, and this is all about getting that carbon reduction strategy, what are we trying to do? How are we trying to achieve our carbon reduction? Where's best to do it? Well, to answer the question of where's best to do it is, what are those big hotspots? So carbon footprinting is a way of measuring the greenhouse gases emitted through an organization or a product or a service or a project even. You can do it on a package. So it's a way of measuring things. To do it, you need to set your goal. What are you trying to achieve? What's the purpose of what you're doing? How much money you're going to get to do the study? Who's going to read it? Who's the audience? But then once you've got that, setting the goal and the boundaries, what are we including in that process? And then going out and getting your data, analysing your data, and coming back with an assessment, a report of saying, well, this is where the hotspots are and what we can do about it. Some simple things here that you need to be aware of to give you a light touch on some of the key inputs that we need. So there's something called operational boundaries, and you'll see that this reflects the slide I had earlier with the 3 green arrows, you know, where the emissions come from: your own business, your supplier, and your customer as well. Direct emissions are what come from your organization. They're called scope 1. So your own vehicles, your own fleet, your own chemical process. That's called scope 1. Everything else is your indirect emissions. basically where you've paid someone else to do something on your behalf. So scope 2 is generally speaking your electricity. You've purchased it off an energy provider. And scope 3 is all your other supply chain inputs. So your water company provider, your waste provider, your supplier of materials and goods, your haulage, third-party provider, and so on. So this is some of the key jargon you need to be aware of, scope 1, 2, and 3. I'm actually doing another one of these sessions on Wednesday, I believe, which goes into this a lot more, into scope busting, as it's called. So if this is something you'd like to know more about, log on to the school's website and pick the lunch and learn. That's on Wednesday, I believe. I think, Rosie, if you're able to put the link in the chat, that would be helpful. Thank you. Linking some of those up, because it can be quite confusing, and often the case is made, well, is this double counting? It is not double counting, but that's why we have the scopes 1, 2, and 3, because essentially, and this diagram helps to try and explain it. If I'm a tier 0 client, I've got my supply chain emissions, my scope 3 emissions, but those are made up by my suppliers. And those same emissions for my supplier might be their scope 1 or scope 2 emissions, but for me, they're my scope 3 emissions. So it's the same actual carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases emitted, but it's how we apportion it, how we bucket it out for our different uses, so that we don't get into double counting. So we need to make sure that when we talk about scopes, we know who's owning those scopes. So as I say, if I'm a client and you're my supplier, I have my scope 3 emissions, but you as my supplier are providing something for me, and you consumed electricity in the process of doing that. That's your scope 2, but it's part of my scope 3 as well. You saw that one earlier. And then this is kind of how we build up our boundaries. So you'd essentially focus on your own organization. You should be able to get data for your own organization's footprint. And that's what's in that red box, your own vehicles, your own buildings, and so on. You should be able to get it for electricity through billing and other sources as well. You've got a relationship with the power provider, but likewise also your business travel. You might have a travel agency, your HR team, or just yourself through your own expenses. You might be able to capture your business travel, scope 3 carbon. And then there's all the others, which largely leans into procurement with your supply chain and your commercial team. What are we buying? Could be your QSs, for example. What are we buying and how much of it are we buying? And what's the associated carbon with that? So lots of sources for data. You're going to need data if you're going to do this for your fuels, your natural gas, gas oil, diesel, plant and vehicles, and so on. If you've got any fugitive emissions, so those are little leaks from your HVAC system, for example, process emissions, if you're in a chemical sector where you're manufacturing something and greenhouse gases are given off as a byproduct, cement being the most obvious and common one, electricity we've talked about, business travel as well, the materials and products, and also third-party logistics. So this is just a kind of a good sample of where you might want to be getting that data from. And this is the kinds of data you might be looking for. So this is what we call activity data. So the activity that's happened that gives rise to carbon emissions. So you're burning fuel, litres of fuel. You're releasing, inadvertently, litres of refrigerant from your HVAC. So there might be a small amount there that when someone comes around to maintain the HVAC, they have to top the system up a little bit. They're topping it up by the amount that's been leaked. Kilowatt hours of electricity that you've consumed, or mileage traveled, so on and so on. So that's the activity data that you are looking to get. And these are some of the parts of your organization and outside your organization where that data might reside. So this is ultimately about making relationships with the right people to know where that information is, to help you build up that fuller carbon footprint that you need as your baseline to then build your strategy and say, we know what our overall footprint is, or we've got a good handle on it, and we know where our hotspots are, and therefore we know what we need to do. That baseline is built up by speaking to all these different people in fleet, HR, your travel agency, or your expenses claims and so on. To get through to the data that you need. Cool. Putting it in very simple terms, a carbon footprint is that activity data, your litres, times an emission factor, and that gives you a carbon emission. The maths is no harder than that. The hardest bit is finding the data, finding the right person who owns that data. So giving you an example, if you were to consume some diesel, 250 litres in this example, you apply an emission factor that you can get for free off various databases. And in this case, it's 2 3/4 kilos of carbon dioxide are emitted every time you burn a litre of diesel. You just multiply the two together, and that gives you your emission. In this case, almost 700 kilos of carbon. Carbon footprinting and getting that baseline is just doing this multiple times for different situations within your organization. The key point here is carbon dioxide equivalent. So the little e means equivalent, and that basically takes all the different greenhouse gases that I've mentioned earlier and compares them, so you can put them all into one number. So it converts methane into carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide into carbon dioxide. It's a bit like converting pounds to dollars and euros to dollars, so that they're all in dollars, for example. So there's a whole bunch of different emission factors available. And as I say, a lot of these are available for free. They're in databases you can download. You don't have to remember them. You don't have to pay for them. But these are the conversion factors you need to take your activity data, your litres and your kilowatts and your miles, and convert it into carbon dioxide. And here are some of them on the screen. And you can see there's a difference depending on the kind of travel you use or the kind of energy you might use. And this also helps you understand, well, if we're going to go out and put something in place, do we want to get a grid connection or should we use a generator? If we can get a grid connection, of course, because I know it's not always possible, but gives you some more information into that decision process, along with availability of getting a grid connection, along with the price and the time lag and all those kinds of things. This plays into that as well. Similarly with materials, there are emission factors as well, and lots of databases for those that show what the embodied carbon is of a variety of materials. They are not all equal. They all have different impacts. And you can see as you go up to the right, they get bigger and bigger per ton of material produced. And even these figures aren't exact, because it depends on who manufactures it, how they manufacture it, where they ship it from, what kind of ingredients they've used in it. So these will vary. So the ones you're seeing on the screen are kind of averages, global averages, but they will vary. But having this appreciation will help you in that design process, saying, look, we want to reduce our carbon impact as well as make a wonderful asset or a great building. Should we look at what we're actually using to make it? Should we speak to our suppliers on what they can do about it? Cool. I mentioned a minute ago the kind of carbon equivalent piece, and these are some of the numbers that go with that. So this is the piece I was talking about, the pounds to dollars, euros to dollars, and you can see from this that methane is 25 times more reactive than carbon dioxide in terms of global warming potential, GWP. Sulfur hexafluoride, the gas used in switchgear, is over 23,000 times, or almost 23,000 times as impactful as carbon dioxide. So what that means in real terms is, if you have a system that leaks a kilo of sulfur hexafluoride, it's like emitting 23 tons of carbon dioxide. So that's why many organizations are very much focused on those other gases, not just carbon dioxide. So having an appreciation for not all things being equal is really, really important, and being able to convert them is useful as well. I'm going to give you a very brief run through a case study, and then we'll pause, and then we'll have any questions. So this was a piece of work I was involved in recently, building a train tunnel. What's the carbon impact of that? There were two options for how they designed and built this tunnel. One was to cut a trench and then fill in with a square boxed tunnel. That's the top left one. The other one was to do tunnel boring, bore out a tunnel and then put in arches, concrete arches. And those are the two main designs. They had some variation on that, but those are the two main versions. We did all the carbon calculation, gathered that data, understood what the scopes and boundaries were, gathered the numbers and did some crunching. And option one, which was the cut and cover with the square box, comes out to be 125,000 tons of CO2, whereas the tunnel boring with the arch was a lot less, 92,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And the biggest impact, as the graph shows, was around the columns for concrete and reinforcement, those big columns that you can see in the 5th and 6th columns along. And you can see a lot of it was around the reinforcement, the blue column for option 2. And what that meant was that between option 1 and 2, there's a 33,000 ton carbon dioxide equivalent saving. And that was largely due to a lot of earthworks movements. So they were moving less earth because they were doing tunnel boring rather than digging the dirt out, putting it to one side and then moving it back. There was a lot less earth movement, about 2 million meters cubed. And that equated to 73,000 fewer movements of those massive dump trucks. So there you're saving the fuel in those dump trucks, as well as noise and dust and other kind of impacts as well. But for here, it's about the carbon savings from less fuel being used, moving muck around the site, and then directly using less concrete and less steel. Option 2 had less concrete in it, about 22,000 cubes of concrete less compared to option 1, which was about a £2 million saving. And steel was using about 9,000 tons less of reinforcing steel, which again, huge in terms of carbon, but also huge in terms of financial savings. Here are about £4 million of savings. So it's important that these kinds of calculations are undertaken, because it leads not just to carbon, but to cost savings as well. And then what does that mean in terms of comparisons? Because 33,000 tons of carbon is a huge number, and it kind of means nothing to most people. It means nothing to me. So you have to kind of convert it. What does it mean as an equivalent? And here are some examples of what it could convert to. And the one that stands out most for me is that third sub-bullet point about 10,000 UK homes. The energy being used by 10,000 UK homes for a whole year across their electric and gas demand. And there's a few UK towns and cities provided there. So it's a big impact, it's a significant saving. And as I say, it all goes into that kind of procurement and design process alongside cost, alongside quality, delivery of service, reduced risk of accidents, all that kind of stuff as well. But carbon is another lens to look at. Cool. Almost done now, conscious of the time. Primary data sources, something here as well about where you might get your activity data from. I was talking about those different organizations, those different departments that you might want to get your data from. Just think about where that information comes from. You can get real data, you can get proxy data, and you can get sample data. So the most common example of proxy data is probably cost. So if you know how much you spent on something and you know what the unit price was, you can work out how many units you bought and therefore how many kilos or litres that you've consumed as well. And think about the data that's relevant to you, that's relevant to your situation. Is it up to date? Is it reliable? So go in with your eyes open when you're thinking about this. Always consider where you can get your data from, and is it reliable or not? Okay, this is the one I was talking about earlier when I was saying I'm not expecting you to read it, but come back to it when you get the slides later. It's just a one slide full of free resources you can get on the internet about those conversion factors I was talking about, where you look up an emission factor or a conversion factor. So DEFRA, the UK government, provides one on an annual basis, and the University of Bath provides another one as well. So lots of resources out there. Cool. One of the key standards that we've been referring to or alluding to through this Lunch and Learn is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. This is something that's used to set the frame of what we're trying to achieve, and gives you the rules of engagement, how you set out your scopes and your boundaries, and how you calculate your emissions. So that's really useful. And then something that's linked with that is environmental product declarations. So this is how we can use information to understand the impact of a product. More and more organizations are providing an EPD, as they're known, for their product to say, this was the impact of manufacturing the product, and giving you some of those carbon numbers as well. Cool. I'm going to leave you with this one, which you can read later, but there's some advice here about what we can all do at home ourselves, in terms of at home, our diet, our travel, and our purchasing habits at the shops. Some good tips on what we can do at home, all relevant to us, particularly as it's COP now. And then I'm going to pause there. So thank you very much for your time. Apologies, it's gone a couple of minutes over. I can see some questions, which I'm happy to answer now in the chat box. If you need to leave for your next meeting, then please do, by all means. But I'm just going to answer a couple of those questions. Cool. So there's one here from John about what's the view on electric cars increase? This will have an impact on usage, and what company thinking is on this. So yeah, electric cars are really interesting. So some of the information I've seen on electric cars is that the embodied carbon of manufacturing an electric car is far higher than its diesel equivalent or its petrol equivalent. But over the lifetime of that vehicle, in terms of the in-use emissions, the balance tips the other way. So it might be higher, my left hand, it might be higher at the beginning, but over its lifetime, the diesel or petrol car overtakes it in terms of cumulative overall emissions. So it is a good investment, assuming that people use them for long enough. But we also need to think about other impacts as well, about the batteries and how those are produced, where those minerals are sourced from. So again, it's never a straightforward, this is good, this is bad. It's thinking about other things as well, and having conversations with our suppliers on that. Okay. So there's a question here from Scott. Are your suppliers scope 3 emissions also your scope 3 emissions? Not quite, no. So your scope 3 emissions are from your supply chain. For your suppliers, it might be their scope 1 and 2 emissions, but they form part of your scope 3. But then if I'm reading that right, then your supplier has scope 3 as well from their supply chain, which also forms part of your scope 3. So it does ripple through. It's kind of the thing you might want to sit down in a dark room with a stiff drink at some point, because it is quite confusing sometimes about the rippling through of those emissions. But essentially, it goes all the way back up your supply chain. So I think the answer to your question, Scott, is yes, that your suppliers' emissions filter through as your scope 3 as well. So a question here from, I think, Sean, how do you measure carbon post-construction or post-occupancy? So this is something about the performance gap I think you're alluding to here, that you can have an as-designed construction design brief, whether it's an asset or a building or whatever, and there'll be a design scope for it in terms of what the occupancy should be, and then getting into what it actually is the next stage, and making sure that it does live up to what it was designed to be. And that brings in the human aspect as well. How people actually use the facility or building. Is the air conditioning set correctly? Is it maintained properly? Do people know how to use the automatic controls and so on? So getting that is really important as well. Cool. Question here, where seawater is available, is the carbon footprint lower than train? Oh, I see, seawater transport, sorry. Yes, river travel is quite low in comparison. I can't remember the numbers. Sadly, I remember a lot of numbers, but not those numbers. But a good example is Lower Thames Crossing that's being constructed now. They looked at using barges, and they did use barges to take some of the muck away, rather than using trucks around the streets of London, using barges to take it down the Thames round, I think it was East Anglia, and to its final destination to be dumped. That not only saved carbon, but it also reduced congestion impacts around that part of London, the noise, the dust, the air pollution, the general annoyance that you'd get from neighbours as well. So looking at alternatives is really good as well. Cool, excellent. I think that's it for the moment. Thank you very much, everybody. There are more sessions, as I say, in the coming few days. We have one on focusing more on scope busting in a couple of days. We're looking at carbon reporting in particular on Thursday, I think it is, and then we're doing net zero and offsetting and carbon removals on Friday. So thank you for your time and have a good afternoon.